So in your previous tutorial, you learned how to create an input form that can be used by the user to provide input that will be sent, that will be processed by your web application. And in addition, you also implement a mechanism to track a state that tracks who is currently accessing your application and determine whether the current user is able to open or access a certain functionality of your website or your web application. And you implemented that by using session and cookie. Let me ask a question. So is there anyone who has difficulty with the tutorial from last week? Or any troubles in completing the tutorial?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you. So if there are no problems, so I assume everything is okay. But as usual, if you have some difficulty or too shy to talk about your difficulties, just let me know, or the TA. We don't bite freebies, so yeah. Feel free to ask. But yeah, regarding that, I also remember something about when you should contact TA or me regarding your problems in the course. So first of all, if you do have troubles in working on the tutorials, I really suggest you to share your problems first to the general discussion on Discord. Because from what I heard from the TAs, they got a bit overwhelmed whenever the students send them a private message regarding their problem. And at the same time, it is pretty often that the same problem also encountered by other students. So it is possible that the TA will respond to the same question or to the same problem multiple times. So to at least reduce the burden of the TAs, please share your problems or your questions to the general discussion channel, text channel first on Discord. So me or the TAs can follow up with your problems or your questions. And if there is someone that happen to encounter or experience the same problem, then we can refer to the discussion ongoing on the public Discord text channel. So yeah, please just avoid directly send a message to the TA unless if the message is for arranging a demonstration schedule, or if your message is not getting a follow-up in the general discussion, then yeah, you can send a message to the TA. But try to share your problems to the general discussion first before resorting to sending a private message to the TA. Okay, because the TAs are also an active student. They also have their commitments. They also have courses to take, and they also have homework. So let's be considerate. Okay. All right. So continuing the lecture materials, remember that we deal with request and response cycles between a client and also a server. And whenever you send a request to a server, which in this case, the server that hosts your web application, then your request may contain several additional data payload. So if you have done some exploration using a tool such as Postman or HTTPI or even your own web browser, you will notice that in the tools that you use, you can actually inspect the request sent by your tools and even define your own request. For example, in another project that I am currently working on with other students, this is a web application that will provide data about schedules of a conference. And in order to get the data, the request has to be composed first. If you like typing the URL and then type it into the web browsers and then send it, your web browser will send a request, and you can actually inspect the request in the developer tools. So if you still not familiar with developer tools in your web browser, you can check in the options. For example, in Brave or Chromium-based browser, you can access the menu from more tools and then choose the developer tools or using the shortcut, which is the Ctrl+Shift+I if you're using Windows. And in the developer tools, you can choose the network tab, and you will see that your browser will track the requests and also the responses it received. In this example, where the request is blocked because the request is not valid. Because there is a bit of authentication mechanism in the website where every request needs to have this header with the key value is the content type and the associated value is this application/VNB API JSON. So if the request contains this header, then it will be successfully processed by the web application and it will produce the JSON data. So this is the request sent from the client, and the response is also displayed in the tools directly. And yeah, you can inspect the JSON, the formatted JSON, or even the raw string itself if you are using tools like HTTPI or Postman. But yeah, in short, remember that we are dealing with requests and responses when we are implementing a web application. And a request may contain additional data payload. So we can define what the headers in the request and also the body stored within the request. So we have these two most commonly used methods. Remember, we have multiple type of HTTP methods. We have get, post, put, delete, fetch, and so on. But yeah, the most frequent ones that we usually use is only get and post. The remaining can also be used, but it will be more relevant when you are developing a more advanced web application, which outside the scope of this course. But for now, in this course, you most likely will only use post and get method. Okay, and the differences are if you are using get message, then the argument that passed along with the request can be seen in the URL. So I have demonstrated this before. So if you send a get request, then the argument will be displayed in the URL of your web browser. So if somebody happened to capture your screen, then that person can replicate the same GET request. But in contrast, POST will not display your arguments or your data payload in the URL bar in the web browser. So it's a bit more hidden, although you can still inspect the actual data if you are using the developer tools. But at least it is not shown publicly. And POST usually used to transmit the data provided by user in the input fields located in a form. So from your previous tutorial, you created a form containing several input fields, and any input provided by user will be submitted to the web application using the HTTP POST method. So yeah, that's a bit of reviewing about the most common HTTP method. And as for the form itself, you can develop your own form. So you can not develop, but define or compose, to be more exact. Okay, so you can compose your own form with your own defined input fields. So in the previous tutorial, you reuse the existing functionality provided by Django's form class, where the form is generated automatically. But you can also create your own form. So you can, in your HTML page, you can write a tag form, and then you put the action option, the action attribute, and that action attribute usually points to a path on your web application that will receive the request sent by your form. The method can be either GET or POST. So there's an example that you can see in the slide. So it will send a request to example.com/process, and it will send the fields, the data inputted by user, as a HTTP POST message. And the data that will be sent is a text. And the submit here, the input with type submit, is only a button that will trigger the transmission of HTTP POST message to the web application. And yeah, the flow is roughly as follows. So you type your URL in your web browser, the server will receive your request and determines which function that can handle the request coming from your web browser. And if it found the appropriate function, it will do data processing, for example, retrieving data from the database and put it into a web page template. And once it finished, the resulting HTML page is sent back to the web browser as a HTTP response. And then when the user provides inputs to the fields, to a form containing several fields, and the data that is provided by user will be put into the body of a HTTP POST request. And then the server will receive that request and delegates the handling of the POST request to the appropriate function that existing in the web application. If it found the appropriate function to handle the post request, then yeah, it will do something, and eventually it will produce a resulting page that's sent back to user as a HTTP response. So yeah, that's one way to develop a form with several input fields. You can create it manually by creating, by defining the text of form and also the inputs in the web page. But you can also reuse the form class provided by Django, where you can define what the field that will contain user inputted values. So if you follow the example in the slide here, you will have a class called input_form, and that class is associated to a model. And then the input that will be contained in the form is a text that will contain the name of a person. And the way we define the input field in this form class is similar to how we define the model attributes. So you can see in the display name here that if we are going to have a single input field that accepts the name of the user, then we declare a variable, let's call it display_name, and then assign it with a char field where, for example, the length of the maximum number of characters is 27. And the input field will be rendered as a text input by assigning the text input as the value for the widget argument for instantiating the char field object. And later on in the views.py, in the function that handles the request, can return the input form as a context object. So in the context object, you provide the input form, and then you send it back to the web browser. So it's similar. I mean, this is the common pattern how you implement functions in views.py. You receive a request, do something with the request, and prepare the response, then return that response to the client. And later on, the HTML that will be generated by Django is similar to what you see on the slide. And in this slide, and also in the tutorial, actually, you may have noticed that there is this attribute or variable called Csrf token, which Csrf stands for cross-site request forgery. So, does anyone have Googled or looking around about Csrf before? Or is this the first time you learn about Csrf? Yeah, everything usually, yeah, especially if you are new in web development, yeah, this will be new stuff to learn. But yeah, since this topic will also cover a bit about security, for now, just think Csrf_token as an additional measure to ensure that input that submitted from the web browser is coming from an actual user. Well, not exactly, but suppose that we have this kind of scenario. So let's say, let me open a notepad. So let's say we have Alice and Bob. And both of them are accessing this web application. Okay. So Alice can send a request to the web application, and web application can also send a response back to Alice, right? In the middle. So, for example, when Alice send a request to the application, the web application return a response containing a form with input fields, right? And Alice can provide inputs to the form and then send it back to the web application. That's the expected or the normal scenario happening whenever a user is handling an input form. So when a user providing their inputs and then send it back to the web server, that's the normal scenario. At least the user receives the form and then provide some inputs and then send it back to the web application. And during this scenario, let's say we have this user interaction that involving authentication. Well, not authentication. Okay. Let me remember how Csrf works. So what? Please correct me if I'm wrong. But so let's go back to the example that I explained to you. So Alice sending a request to an application, and web application will provide a response. Now, web application can receive any kind of request, right? And not only from a human that interacting with the web application through a web browser, but also another web application. For a program. So this Csrf token, please correct me if I'm wrong, is a measure to ensure that if a web app is providing a response as a form to a user, then the same form is guaranteed can only be filled by the designated user. I mean, if so let's take an example back again using Alice. So when Alice send a request to web application give the response back to Alice, and in the form that is provided from the web application, it includes a Csrf token that will mark Alice as the valid recipient of the form. So when Alice submit the form back to the web application knows that this form was generated for Alice, not for other user. So the web application knows that this form was submitted from an actual user. If there is no Csrf token, then it is possible that other user, let's say it could be another human person or even a program, can send any data to the web application, because there is no checking for the token. Even if the web application or other program attempted to send the data with structure the same as the form expected by the web application, the web application can reject that request because it doesn't contain Csrf token. And even if it contains a Csrf token, most likely the value will not be valid because Csrf token is generated by using a secure cryptographically function usually. So yeah, this is only a measure to avoid potentially bad user to give a bad input to your web application. So that's how Csrf token works. Yeah, to put it in a summary, if you didn't put Csrf token, then other program or sufficiently knowledgeable user can craft or create a request that can be recognized and parsed by your web application. But if there is a Csrf token put into your form, then you can ensure that any submitted data is always come from a form requested by a user, not by other program or by other user that craft their own HTTP request that sent to the web application. So yeah, that's a bit introduction to one functionality in security of web application. There are also other mechanisms to ensure the security of your web application, and you will see later in subsequent pages in the slide. So yeah, this is continuing the forms, for example. So when you have this in a form class and also a template, you can merge them, and Django will return the merged HTML back to user. So in the template, you define the form and the input fields are automatically generated using a function existing in the form object. So this part here, the name column input underscore form dot s underscore p, this one will invoke a function in the form object that will generate the input field for input field that defined in the form object. And since the form object only contains one attribute, then it will produce a single input there immediately after the name string. But if you have multiple attributes, then every attribute will be generated after the name string here. So most likely each attribute will be generated as a single P element, and inside that P element it contains a value which an input element. So each attribute will be rendered as a P element, a paragraph element in the HTML. Right. And similarly, okay, before we move on to the next slide, any questions so far regarding the generation of input form in HTML using Django? Still quite easy, right? Because yeah, in the slide it only contains one attribute, and in the tutorial you define up multiple attributes, and when you try it in the code, the HTML page written from the web application actually contains the input fields for every attribute that you define in your not in your own form, right? The input fields that is generated in the resulting HTML page is based on the attributes of the user login form, right? In your previous tutorial, so it will not login, the user registration form. Okay, I'm sorry. So every attributes defined in the user registration form will be rendered as a series of input elements in the HTML page. So still quite simple, and you don't have to create custom HTML, right, in the previous tutorial. So you can just reuse the registration form provided by Django. But yeah, that's for providing a mechanism for user to give an input. Now, eventually, we need to be able to handle the submitted information from user. So we need to be able to receive the request and then obtain the submitted form from within the request object. And yeah, this is one example how to do that. So you can obtain the post data from the request object and assign it into the input, into the constructor of the form object. So you can provide it with the post data or none if the post data actually contain no data. So this is conditional instantiation. It will create a form with values in it if the post request contains data submitted by user. But if the data is empty, then it will perform something else. So for example, if the form actually contains data, then try to save the data in the form and redirect the user to go back to the, for example, to the root or the initial page of the website. But if the form is empty or contains invalid data, then redirect user immediately to the root page, for example. So yeah, that's one example of handling form submission in Django. So you can, right now, we have multiple approaches in handling input in developing a web application. First, input can be given to web application through the request object. And the request object can contain many kind of data, right? So you can give an input as a URL that will trigger a function on the web application. And also, the request object can contain a form submitted from user's web browser or crafted manually by a user using external third-party client. And that information, the submitted input, can be stored into a form object, and we use existing functions in the form object to perform functionality such as validating whether every input provided by the user is valid or not. For example, we can verify whether the length of string provided by user is less than certain amount of characters. We can enforce like the input field should not be longer than 16 characters. We can define such form. So the input field, we can define that the number of characters, the maximum character should be no longer than 16 characters. And if we happen to receive a request where the length of the characters is greater than 16 characters, then we can mitigate that during the validation process. So we check whether the form is valid first. If it is valid, then we can do further data processing. But if it is invalid, then we immediately reject that request. So yeah, that's handling user input as using request object. We can put the data in the URL, in the request body, where the request body can contain a JSON string or a raw string, or even the form that is submitted by the user. Any questions so far regarding handling user input? Nothing? Okay. So this is, let's move on to the next topic. And this topic is quite interesting, especially in recent times where in Indonesia, we have several occasions of data breach lately. So that also make a concern, especially for the educators in the higher level education institution. We have to ensure that once the students have graduated from the university or from the education institution, we want to at least give them awareness and actually able to implement a secure web application. At least to avoid those kind of security issues and holes that exploited by what do you call it, bad actors, maybe. Yeah. And yeah, there are several kind of threats. So, and the threats that we usually have to handle can spans over multiple layers in terms of the architecture of the application. So there might be security issues when we have a mechanism to handle an input, because remember that as a programmer or a developer, we can build our application whatever we want as long it matches the user requirements. But again, not every user not every user will behave according to our expectation. Some might do behave like we predicted, but oftenly there might be users that perform or behave not according to our expectation, especially if the users are not part of the system. For example, a hacker or bad actors that try to gain access to the web application, or even can access deeper to the infrastructure that hosting the web application. So we have to handle this in, for example, when we have to deal with input provided by user. And remember, input can be submitted from, well, not from, but rather than input, the first okay, let me rephrase my explanation. So in a when developing web application, the first factor, the first channel where user can provide an input is by using HTTP request, right? Because user will interact with your web application using a web browser or HTTP client. Okay, I'm still sharing my screen, right? Okay. So we have to put our defense foremost in the input handling. And therefore, we have to put several security mechanisms in, for example, in the HTML page. So we can implement CSRF token, and maybe we can also put client-side validation. So we can try to ensure that the input match to certain rules that we define in the web page directly using a JavaScript code, which you will learn later on. But again, JavaScript can be disabled, so we cannot really be sure that the input is already been cleaned up or restricted via client-side scripting when it is submitted to the web application. So the second layer of defense is will be the if we referring to Django, so the second line of defense will be the fuse.py. So when we receive an input to the fuse.py, we need to verify that the request actually valid, and we have to ensure the data submitted by user is clean. It doesn't contain a dirty values or potentially dangerous value that can exploit an unintended behavior in our web application. And then the third layer for the defense is, especially if you are developing a web application that will store a data to a data source such as database, then we have to validate or perform security check before we save the data into the data source. So we can also have a validation in model level. So we validate, we ensure that the values are correct before we actually store the data into the database. And yeah, you can do that manually, or you can also do that using the existing functionality provided by the framework. For most of the time, you can simply use the existing functionality provided by the framework. But yeah, you need to be aware that we are developing a web application or a program that will receive input, and input is not always clean. It might contain unexpected values, or it can also contain a seemingly fine or clean value, but it can be used to exploit a security hole in our web application. So yeah, please be careful when developing a web application or even any program that will accept user input. And the potential threats are there are several potential threats related to web application. Sql injection, one example is the famous example is what is it called? The comic SKVD. So this is one example of Sql injection described in a comical way. So if you currently learning about database course, or you already have some familiarity with database technology, we usually interact with database using a separate language called SQL. And suppose that we have a program or web application that receives a text input, then SQL injection is possible if that text input is not handled properly in a way that when the text input is received by the web application, it is interpreted directly as a SQL statement that is sent to the database. So in this comic, this person is being naughty. They provide the name of their son as Robert, single colon, single quote, closing bracket, semicolon, drop table students, and that is a valid SQL statements that will resulting in deleting a table named students in the database. So yeah, that's one example of SQL injection. There's also another threat like denial of service. This can be done by making a large amount of requests at the same time to a web application. And yeah, there are also other threats as well. You can check it later. And yeah, I mentioned before that we need to be careful with inputs sent by user, right? And when you are reusing functionality provided by the web framework, usually they already provided what is called as the middleware. So to provide you with an illustration, think of middleware like a proxy or a middleman. Okay, so let me get. I will just use my mouse for now. I haven't fixed my tablet. So let's say we have a request here. A request, and this is your web application, Django. Now, from the beginning, every request that is received by Django will be handled by views.py, right? So we have this views.py. But actually, before reaching views.py, it is possible that we have several middlewares that will process the incoming request before actually given into a function in the views.py. So we can have multiple sequence of middleware here. MW1, which will perform some data processing and give it to second middleware, and so on until eventually it is received by the views.py. So we can have a series of processing pipelines that will receive the request and do something toward that request, and the result of that processing is given to the next middleware if exists, or given to the views.py if it already reached the end of processing the request processing pipeline. And in this example, Csrf will be handled automatically because it is a part of the middleware involved in processing the incoming request. So if when a user or someone send a request to the Django application, and when the request is going through the sequence of middlewares, and it found out that the Csrf middleware found out that the request that didn't contain a valid token, then the request is immediately rejected before the request reach the views.py. But yeah, if we do want to have one or so function that can receive any type of request, even if it doesn't contain a valid CSRF token, we can also do so by including annotation or decorator in the views.py. So it will tell the middleware that if there is a request that will go to this function, then this request should be exempted from Csrf checking. Yeah, this is the example. So we can tell the views.py to accept a Csrf or not. By default, the request processing will check for Csrf because the default Django settings includes a Csrf middleware. So yeah, every request will be checked for the validity of the Csrf token. But if we do one for a function to handle every request, including a request that doesn't contain a valid Csrf token, we can also tell the middleware to accept this function. So in this example, the my_view annotated with Csrf exempt decorator will be able to receive any kind of request, even if the request doesn't contain a valid Csrf token. And yeah, any questions so far regarding Csrf and the request processing pipelines in Django? So this is a new thing, right? I mean, previously you only know that any incoming request will be handled by views.py, but now actually before every request is handled by the views.py, it is possible that it will involve one or more middlewares in between. And you can actually customize the middlewares that involved in the request processing pipeline. And yeah, since this is a framework, you can actually develop your own middleware. But yeah, I don't think it is included in this course. I mean, yeah, this is usually for our basic purpose. Usually we don't develop our own middleware. Usually, if we do require a custom middleware, we look for an existing third-party middleware on the internet and then just reuse it as long as it matches with the license that we require. For example, if we only want an open source component, then we look for an open source middleware that can be included into our project. So yeah, if you do require a custom middleware, try to look for third-party solution first before resorting to developing your own middleware. But yeah, it could also be interesting if you want to practice programming. Now, let's go to the XSS, cross-site scripting. So, it is possible that we have a user to inject a script that will be, for example, sent to the web application, and then the data can be sent to another different user, and the data is actually containing a script, a client-side script, such as a JavaScript code that can be executed. in other person's web browser. So if there is no proper input sanitation performed in the controller, then it is possible that this kind of request that contain this, what do you call it, this string is executed. Because this is a valid JavaScript code. Script is a tag, an HTML tag, where any text put in between of the opening and the closing tag is a JavaScript code. And since alert is a valid JavaScript code, then when a page containing that string is returned to web browser, the web browser will immediately interpret that string as a JavaScript code, and then it will execute it in the web browser. So yeah, again, this is also one example of it is important to do proper input sanitation of any input coming from your user. But yeah, Django is quite smart. I mean, the developers of Django are pretty smart already. They are including the built-in feature to handle this kind of scenario. So they already provide a function to validate the input, and if the validation function found out that there is an attempt, or not attempt, but if there is a text value that's submitted from user containing a client-side script, then it will be considered as an invalid input from the validation function. Okay. So even we haven't reached the subject about CSS and JavaScript, let me ask you something here. What will happen in this scenario? So we have this web page, and the web page contains a Django template variable called var, var, and then let's say somebody sent a request, and that request eventually will make the var variable to contain this string. Class 1 almost over equal to alert, that with argument hack. And the resulting HTML will be this. So this is the HTML that will be returned to the web browser. So my question is, what will happen? What will happen to the browser that renders or that opens a web page that contains this HTML element? Has anyone tried this before? No one? Or just by looking at the code, what will happen if okay, let me rephrase my question. So this code will pop up alert page. So let me give you one example. Oops, I need to clear this before. Okay, let me write an example page. Example.html. So type HTML, then add and body, and let's say we have this div tag. Well, I need to go back to the editor. Where is it again? So we have this script tag. And then let's open it. And Visual Studio Code render HTML. All right, I can just open it in web browser. Oh, this page says hack. No. So this will what will happen. So a pop-up will show in the web browser, and it says whatever string given in the alert function call. Now, my question is, under what condition that pop-up will show up if we have this HTML example? Can anyone figure out or guess when this alert will show up? Is it immediately when the user opens the HTML page, or when user doing something else? Okay, yeah, you can try it in your own time later, and yeah, maybe you can also share the result, your finding later in the next tutorial. And yeah, there are several security issues, but let's try to focus or at least know the most commonly occurred security issues. Okay. There are a lot of them, but usually the most frequently used reference is the OWASP. OWASP usually provide a top 10 security issues that commonly found in a web application. So every year they publish a top 10 list, and you can see that there are in 2021 there are the following 10 issues here are the most frequently occurring security issues. For example, there's an issue about injection, the Sql injection. So not only providing a string that look like a valid SQL string, but also other input that might be valid, that can be handled by the application, but it will trigger an unexpected behavior in the other components that involved in running the application. And that's exactly what happened in these security issues last year, Log4Shell. You can see later in your own free time, but to summarize, Log4Shell is a vulnerability where a user can craft a specific request, which will be sent to a web application that developed using Java. And on Java, the common web application usually use a logging framework. So a logging framework is a collection of functions that is used to provide not for login mechanism. Okay, logging is not for login, not for authentication, but logging is for displaying information from within the application. So when you using print statements in your Python code or console.log in your JavaScript or client-side scripts, it is a form of logging. you try to display the state of your web application to the shell or to your terminal. Similarly, the logging framework also do that. So it will display a text into the output stream of the process that runs your web application on the server. And that output stream is stored into several variations of data storage. It can be stored into a log file in the web server or stored into a database. Now, back to this log4shell. The log4shell, you can view it like a print statement when using Python. Okay. Now, this log4shell will can be exploited by crafting a request that specifically will become a string that will be interpreted by the logging function provided by the log4j logging framework. And when the logging framework interprets that request, it will make it is possible to execute a shell command that running your web application. So in short, if a web application that is vulnerable with log4shell exploit, then we can craft a request that eventually will be interpreted as a shell command that runs on the server. So it is possible that we can, this is only a really simplified example, but by exploiting log4shell, we can have a request that eventually it will be translated into a shell command like performing this kind of function, rm/rf in Linux server, and it remove the home directory. So we can trigger this if we try to exploit the log4shell vulnerability. But yeah, it is not as simple as creating a HTTP GET request using Postman. It's more complicated than that. So yeah, even though it is require extra effort to exploit this vulnerability, but it is still possible, especially some bad actors already developed tools that making exploiting this vulnerability quite easy. So they can only just run a script, and that script will compose the request that may also contain the shell commands that you want to execute on the server that running a web application. Yeah, it was a mess last year. Okay, so let's go back to this slide. Yeah, this is the top 10 most commonly found security issues. But if we want to be more formal, like we want to have a set of checklists that needs to be checked upon before we deploy our application, then we can also refer to this standard. This is a quite big document. It contains several, quite number of checklists. And in short, this provides a guidance to determine how secure is your application. So if we look at the content of that document, let's check it. PDF. Okay, and open it. So yeah, it contains a lot of aspects that needs to be evaluated when you are reviewing about the security of your web application. So let's see regarding the issues related to logging. So in this example, there are two checklists. First, the logging should follow a common format that is used across according to the industry standard. And the second is the log messages produced by the application is stored to external separate system. So it can be stored into a log file or stored into a database that is running on different server. And there's this L1, L2, L3. I suppose this is, what do they define this? Yeah, it's like a level. L1 is the easiest level, where, yeah, according to this description, usually the L1 checklist can be verified using automated tests. So you don't have to actually review your web application and also the infrastructure that runs your web application. But for the L2 and L3, it is a more advanced checklist, and it will require a more in-depth code review process to ensure that your application comply with that level. But yeah, as usual, this is only a guideline, a guidance, a guidebook, and what the decision to adopt it or not, it depends on the company you work for. If your company actually care about security, maybe they will follow this standard to ensure the security of the web application that they develop. And yeah, there are a lot of factors involved when deciding whether or not to perform this kind of activities. Again, yeah, we have project constraints like human resource, time, and also money, the most important. If there are no resources, then yeah, maybe we have to be more cautious with the budgets, and that can translate to abandoning several activities that should be performed ideally. Okay, so that's quite that was a quick introduction to the most common issues in web security. Well, there are a lot more. You can review it on your own later. Now, we reach to the next part that you have already done in the tutorial, authentication and authorization. So this is like the two terms that often viewed as equal, but actually they are different. It is the same as the usage of effective and efficient in Indonesian and also in English. Pretty often people consider both terms are or do have similar meaning, but actually they have different meaning. Effective and efficient, and so does authentication and authorization. Sounds similar, but they actually have different meanings. So what do you think? What is the difference between authentication and authorization? Is it the same or they have different meaning? Can anyone share their opinion about authentication, the difference between authentication and authorization? Okay, or let me give you an example. Okay, so let's say that you are going to a public place. So nowadays, if you going to public place like to a shopping center or a mall or a public venue, you still need to check in using the Peduli Lindungi app, right? And if there is a security officer in the front of the entrance, you need to show them the proof of your check-in. Is that an authentication process or authorization process? Okay, I see a chat in. Okay, so Rafael mentioned about authorization is to let someone pass or connect. Okay, while authentication is checking if someone is using the right credentials. Right, that is correct, Rafael. Okay, so since there is a response in the chat, so I'm going to continue using that response. So authentication is to prove that you are actually someone that you claim to be. So for example, let me open Sql again and to log out. If I want to log into Sql, then I have to prove it to Sql that I am using my own account that is identified by my username, and I also need to provide the password. Well, I can type my password here, but obviously, when I submitted my valid username and the correct password to Sql, Sql knows that there is a request from a user with string equal to my own name and password equal to something. And since this pair of username and password has a match in the database, then it is valid. This person that attempted to access Sql can be authenticated because there is a matching credential stored in the database. So Sql can authenticate my account because I attempted to log in using the valid credentials. Since I provided Sql with the correct username and password, Sql can authenticate me and then grant me with additional access. And this is the view that is granted to me after I successfully log into Sql. So you can look at the list of courses that I joined in. And in this example, so I can, authentication is to prove that you are actually the person you claim to be in the system. But then authorization is to check whether you actually have the permission to do certain functionality. Yeah, the simplest example is, let's look at scaling. If you are not a TA or a lecturer, then you won't be able to see this button. Where is the draw? This button can only be seen by lecturer and TA. And it is for modifying the content of the course page. So I can edit or add some additional resources into the course page on scaling. And that's related to authorization because my account as lecturer is authorized to edit the course page. But then, if you attempted to edit this course, like we can see in the bottom left. So let me put my cursor on top of the edit button. You can see that in the bottom left, there is a URL. Csrf/CSUI/course/view.php question mark ID equal to something, session key equal to something, and edit equal to on. If you try to copy this URL and put it into your URL bar, you won't be able to edit the course page, even though you type the same URL. Because even though you are authenticated into scaling, you don't have the proper authorization to edit the course page. Because you have different roles from me or from the TA. You don't have access to edit the course page. So that's authorization. You can be authenticated to a website or a web application, but you might not authorize to use all of the functionalities provided by the web application. So it's like if I go to a public venue, for example, yeah, I can prove my own ID if the public venue require me to hand on my national ID card. Yeah, that's common approach if you go to public buildings or office where you have to leave your ID card in the receptionist. But then when you are given an access card by the receptionist, the access card may only able to grant you access to certain office floors or rooms because it's limited. Your authorization is only as a visitor in the building. But if you are, for example, a manager or an actual employee in that building, you will have more authorization. You will have more access to the whole building because you are actually an employee there. The access that is granted to you as employee will be broader than the access given to an ordinary visitor. That energy also applies in web application. So you can have authentication authorization mechanism put into the web application. You can authenticate certain person, but each registered person in your application may have their own set of roles in the web application. And each role may have their own functionalities, the limited number of functionalities assigned to them. So yeah, process you are verifying that you are actually the person you claim to be, and the authorization is the process where you are actually have the access to perform something in the system, to perform a function in the system. So thank you, Rafael. That's a good answer. Now, there's another question in the slide. So do we need authentication and authorization? What would your response to this question? Do we need both of them? Yeah. Or not? Or it depends. Okay. Yeah, you can ponder on this question. Because yeah, I noticed we only have limited time while there are still some slides to cover. Yeah, at least 20 more slides. Yeah, in short, since we are using framework, try to reuse existing functionality provided by the framework. Because it is more safer and usually it's already more proven to use or reuse existing functionality than writing your own authentication mechanism. Because Yeah, again, Django framework already been used by a lot of developers. Therefore, there are a lot of functionalities that already been addressed by the framework, including authentication. And the default mechanism usually already quite secure enough to be used by common developer. So avoid writing your own custom authentication process. Just try to reuse the existing authentication if it is provided by the framework. And yeah, the flow, if we include authentication and authorization, then it will add additional process when handling the request. In the Django parts. So now, yeah, as I mentioned before, we can reuse existing functionality from Django. So if we want to define a user that representing the user of the system or the application, yeah, we can either create our own user class, or we can just reuse the user class provided by Django. If we reuse, then we basically do not have to do anything, right? We can just invoke the functions that already provided by Django. So yeah, we don't have to create a new code essentially. So if your user is quite simple, well, you can follow this example. But if you do need more capability in defining user in your application, then you can either extend that user class or compose it into your own custom user implementation. But yeah, using the existing user class is more preferable because it already integrated with the admin functionality in Django framework. So you can create a default user by using the manage.py script in Django. This is different from what I've experienced in another different programming language. To create a user, either we have to create it manually in the database or include it in the deployment process. So when we open the web app, in the web application, the first page that displayed to the user is the page to register the first admin user. But in Django, it is more, I think, more convenient. We can create user from the command line directly. And yeah, password. Again, do not try to write your own custom implementation to storing a password. Use existing mechanism like a hash function. And usually you don't need to write your own hash function. It already been provided by the framework. A hash function is a function that will transform your string, any input actually, to a different string that is cryptographically secure. What I mean is, it is guaranteed that for every input, then the hash value is unique. So we can assume that if somebody give a password equal to A, then the value will be different from from another input given by user. So for example, to give you a proper illustration again, in Linux, there is a function called 512, F512. Not. Oh, I haven't installed just F5. Okay. Oh well. I can install it right away. As yeah. A bit different from what I imagined. Okay, disregard that. I think I can just compute it here. Sharp 512 of LOL. So this is a hash function that using an algorithm called SH8512. And if we provide it with a value, then it is guaranteed or almost guaranteed that it will always produce a unique value. So A and B will produce a different hash value. And this uniqueness is applied in security, where instead of storing the actual password string, we store the hash value of the password. So even if the database is supposedly leaked or hacked, the hacker or the bad actor can only see the hash values instead of the raw string of the password. So yeah, your password is not immediately exposed to the bad actor. However, it is still possible to reverse look up your password based on the hash value. So, for example, the bad actor can use a program that will check for every possible combination of string and use it as input to the hash function to see whether there is a match to a hash value that they have. If there's a match, that most likely that string that is automatically generated or combined is a password to that particular user whose hash value is their password, their hashed password. So yeah, it's still not while it makes our password completely obscure, but it's still possible to reverse look up the password by developing a program to try for every possible combination of string and see the hash results. And if there is a match, then likely that is the password of that user. And yeah, the mechanism to perform login to authenticate a user is already covered in the tutorial. And there are also another login mechanism, such as using OAuth. For example, you can ask your user to log in using a third-party platform like Facebook or Google. But you can also develop your own, but it is very complicated. So we usually, in this context of this course, I only expect that you just reuse the existing OAuth provider instead of developing a new OAuth provider. So I think that's all for today. And yeah, the code for labeling your attendance. So code for today is PY0 EUU. So I think that's all for today. at least you know more about form and also the authentication process, or in short, this topic covered about handling user input and then what happened in the process for receiving in request from user into the Django application, and also you learn about how to perform authentication and authorization in Django. There are still some pages left in the slide, especially there is a content about, let me check, relational models. So when you are defining a data model in your Django application, you need to map it to, it is possible to map your existing data model to a table in your database, but in Django it can be done rather simple by defining it as a model, right? Usually a model will translate to a table in the database. However, if you are currently taking database course in this semester, or you already have some familiarity with database, you will know that every table can also have relation to another table. For example, a user may have several items in their to-do list, and each item in the to-do list are specific to a certain person. That kind of relationship can also be defined in Django's model. So in the database, you can model that relation by defining a foreign key and primary key between tables. But since we are implementing the relational models in Django, instead of defining a primary key and foreign key directly in the database, we define it in Django model classes instead. So yeah, you can learn about the models more in the documentation and also in the slide that I already uploaded to Scaling. Okay, so that's all for today. Any questions before I end the class? No questions so far? Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone for attending today's session, and don't forget to arrange a demo schedule with your TA. And yeah, I think I can end the session now. So thank you everyone, and I will see you later in the coming Thursday lab session. So bye-bye. I'm going to end the Zoom room, okay?